anything that's hurting my mitochondria is making me less metabolically healthy.
There's one word that your listeners need to walk away with and understand. It's mitochondria.
We are on a mission to inspire, heal, and bring the world closer together. Welcome to Commune. My name is Jeff Krasno. Today we're discussing mitochondria and their vital role in human health. So mitochondria are wee small organelles in the cell that produce energy, otherwise known as ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, from the food that you eat and the oxygen that you breathe. And they do this through a process known as cellular respiration, which has 3 stages. Number 1, glycolysis. Number 2, the citric acid cycle, aka the Krebs cycle. And number 3, the electron transport chain. Now, these fascinating jelly bean shaped structures actually have their own genetic material, all of which you inherit from your mother, and that's distinct from the DNA in the nucleus of the cell. Now, their origin goes back billions of years when a prokaryote archaea engulfed a purple bacteria, and this romantic tryst birthed aerobic respiration, essentially the production of energy with the use of oxygen, and this springboarded complex life. It's pretty amazing. The mitochondria in our cells animate literally everything that we do, from the conscious viewing of this video to the unconscious digestion occurring in your gut. Now, each cell in our body, with the exception of mature red blood cells, contain mitochondria, and a different number of them. Your brain cells, your neurons, your cardiac cells, brown fat, and muscle cells boast the highest concentrations of mitochondria. And that makes good sense, given the significant energy requirements of those cells. So in this episode, we'll be hearing from 3 brilliant doctors, Dr. Stephen Gundry, my dear friend Casey Means, and Robert Lustig, as we explore how mitochondria function and occasionally dysfunction. Now, our first guest is Dr. Stephen Gundry. He is a physician, a former cardiac surgeon, and a researcher who investigates the impact of diet on human health. Now, he's going to set the stage for our discussion with his helpful and humorous metaphor that explains mitochondrial function. He calls it the Mitoclub. Without further delay, here's Dr. Stephen Gundry. Okay, so I think this is a good time to talk a little bit about energy production in the body and the mitochondria. And you use this absolutely hilarious and very fun metaphor in the book with the nightclub analogy, the Mitoclub.
Yeah, so the electron transport chain, which was proposed by Sir Peter Mitchell, who also finally won the Nobel Prize. The electron transport chain, simplistically, I call a nightclub that has an entrance on one end of the nightclub and an exit on the other end of the nightclub. And 20-somethings, which we'll call energy substrates, like glucose, like proteins, like free fatty acids, enter this nightclub. I call it the Mitoclub, and it's the hippest, hottest place in town. And they go there for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to couple with oxygen. And if they couple with oxygen, then they leave the nightclub via a one-way revolving door. And this is the process of leaving the electron transport chain coupled, produces ATP, literally very much like water going over a water wheel, producing energy. And there's only one way out. And in this nightclub, the the electron transport chain is really changing energy levels of electrons and protons. It's getting them excited. And we laugh in longevity that, the only purpose of life is to move an electron from one level of charge to another. But I digress. So things, and believe it or not, this club is hot, it's steamy, it's sweaty. There's so many hormones going on. There's drinking, and all for the purpose of getting this coupling going. Well, that's all well and good. But the process of coupling has a lot of side effects. There are fistfights. There's a lot of drunken craziness. And we actually have bouncers in the nightclub. And people probably know of at least one of the bouncers. It's glutathione. The other bouncer, which is a surprise to almost everybody, is melatonin. And it's a surprise to almost everybody that we only have two antioxidants that actually work in our mitochondria, glutathione and melatonin, but we'll digress for a minute. In the process of looking to couple up, electrons will also, just because everybody's rowdy, will couple with oxygen by, if you will, mistake. And we now know that coupling process produces free radicals, produces reactive oxygen species. And while some of those are pretty good, they make it a pretty interesting place to be. A lot of them we now know is one of the major processes that damage the club, the mitochondria. And pretty soon, you've got beer all over the place and broken chairs, and it's no longer the hip place that you want to be. So that's how the electron transport chain works. And part of what glutathione and melatonin do is to tamp down this unwanted coupling, if you will, and try to get oxygen to couple with protons and make some CO2 and head out the door. What was fascinating to me when Peter Mitchell proposed this, a lot of very smart chemists said, no, wait a minute. The process of making ATP using this system, using mitochondria, you should take one molecule of glucose and always get 32 molecules of ATP every time. It's a chemical equation. And and Peter Mitchell said, well, wait a minute. You guys are all running these experiments with isolated mitochondria, and guess what? Sometimes we're getting 28 molecules of ATP. Right. Yeah. Yeah. And what's happening to those guys? So it wasn't until really when his theory was accepted that almost and he got the Nobel Prize on, I think, in 1978. Almost simultaneously, three researchers said, he's right about all of this, but what's missing is, well, where were these? Why weren't we getting 32 molecules of ATP? So they proposed that there were literally emergency exits along the electron transport chain that were controlled by what were called uncoupling proteins that could literally open the door of an emergency exit and let protons escape from the club instead of going all the way down through the revolving door. And they proposed that these escape hatches, and there were 5 of them, would be why, all these experiments, you never got to that magic number of 32. And so when I learned about uncoupling proteins, and I started putting 2 and 2 together, I realized that a great amount of the calorie potential to produce energy was automatically being wasted and net out of the electron transport chain. And in fact, I didn't know this, but 30% of all the calories that we eat never make it into ATP production. They are wasted out these emergency exits in the mitoclub. So now you go, well, wait a minute. If you're designing an animal, that's really stupid, because now he basically has to eat 30% more food just to produce the energy to stay alive. So what's the deal? Well, one of the deals is in the process of letting these protons escape from the glove, they produce heat. And we happen to be warm-blooded animals. And believe it or not, even cold-blooded animals depend on this to keep their body temperature. And so heat production is an important part of this. But what became apparent, and we'll go into DMP in a minute, is that you could waste a lot of calories by opening up these emergency exits. You could literally do a caloric bypass. Well, it just so happens that ketones aren't some phenomenal fuel. It turns out that ketones are a phenomenal signaling molecule that actually, among other things, actually do three things. They tell mitochondria to waste fuel, to open up these emergency exits, which on the surface seems really stupid to do. Because ketones' original purpose was to be produced during starvation, to keep the brain kind of hanging in there until food arrives. And it would make no sense if you're starving to death to waste fuel. And then I stumbled upon an obscure paper by Dr. Martin Brand. And the paper was published in 2000. I recommend it to anybody because it's actually an easy read. And the paper is simple: Uncouple to Survive. And that's the name of the paper. And he said, in extremis, at all costs, a mitochondria has to protect itself from death, because if the mitochondria dies, it doesn't matter what happens to the muscles, it doesn't happen to anybody else, you're screwed. So the mitochondria should do everything in its power to protect itself. So stepping back for a second, producing energy is really costly. It's really damaging the mitochondria. The club becomes a mess. So if we actually waste some of all these people entering the club, the place calms down. So that's number one. Number two, it's okay to waste energy, but you got to have a certain amount of energy production or things flutter to a stop. So it turns out that ketones and other substances actually tell mitochondria not only to waste some of the stuff out the side door, but to make more of themselves to share the workload. Now it really starts to make sense because, okay, you're protecting each individual mitochondria by having it work less, but you're simultaneously adding more mitochondria to take up the workload, each at a reduced work. I'll give you an example. Let's say we have a dog sled, since it's now winter, and we have a 2-dog sled pulling a guy, and they're doing a lot of work. If we add 6 more dogs, we now have an 8-dog sled. Each of those dogs now has to do about a quarter of the work that the 2 guys did, but you're going to get, you're going to go as fast, probably faster. So it actually makes sense to have a program to make a lot more mitochondria when times are tough. And for instance, most people have heard of brown fat. Brown fat is brown because it's so packed with mitochondria that it's literally brown. And brown fat, it turns out, is actually one of the keys to lifelong health. And brown fat produces heat, and we can actually see it. So mitochondria protect themselves. They build more of themselves, called mitogenesis. And the third thing that happens from ketones is it literally instructs mitochondria to repair themselves, to do the maintenance that's needed to keep them in tip-top condition. And so as I talk about the Mitoclub owner actually wants less people in his Mitoclub to a point where it's a place to be, but he doesn't want to lose those customers, so he builds more Mitoclubs to take up the slack. And well, like you say, I carry the analogy to its final end.
Hopefully, Dr. Gundry's Mitoclub metaphor helped you understand how mitochondria function as the energy producers of your cells. Now, in this next segment, we'll learn more about glucose and what happens when too much of it shows up at the club. Now, here's a quick primer on glucose metabolism. Now, your body generally uses glucose from carbohydrates to generate energy in the form of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Now, glucose is absorbed through your small intestine and into your bloodstream, and then ushered to your cells by a peptide hormone called insulin, which is secreted from your pancreas. Now, if you have too much serum glucose because you scarfed down a milkshake with a bowl of pasta and a pizza and some ice cream, well, your pancreas will need to produce more insulin to accomplish its job. And if this pattern continues over time, then eventually your cells will become stingy about letting glucose into the club, and you'll become insulin resistant. Now, when high levels of glucose are abandoned in the bloodstream, a few things can happen, including, number one, some glucose can get stored in the liver as glycogen, essentially stockpiled for a rainy day. Number two, glucose will get converted into triglycerides and stored in adipose tissue or fat. Number three, glucose can combine with hemoglobin, the protein in your blood that's famously tasked with shepherding oxygen to your cells, to form an inflammatory glycoprotein. So high blood sugar levels are concomitant with diabetes, which is correlated with cardiovascular disease and dementia. In short, this is why sugar can be considered the world's most dangerous assassin. Now, Dr. Casey Means, the expert for our next segment, is a Stanford-trained physician and the chief medical officer and co-founder of metabolic health company Levels. Now, she reveals the downstream impacts of excessive glucose and fructose on your mitochondria and shares protocols that you can implement to repair that damage. And here you have the esteemed Dr. Casey Means. What happens when we have excess glucose in our bloodstream, and what are some of the downstream or knock-on impacts of that?
Glucose is blood sugar, of course, and for that to be taken out of the bloodstream into the cells to be processed or stored, it requires, in most cell types, insulin, which is like a lock and key that when glucose comes into the bloodstream and rises, the pancreas releases this hormone insulin, which then binds to the cell receptor and allows for the glucose to come in. The glucose then is going to be transported to the mitochondria. And this is the key thing. Anything that damages the function of the mitochondria is going to essentially create a backup of glucose in the cell that's ultimately going to also signal for this process called insulin resistance to happen. And insulin resistance is a sort of protective mechanism of the cell saying, we're not able to process all this glucose, so stop putting it in the cell. So the cell becomes less sensitive to that insulin signal, and therefore what's going to happen is less glucose is going to get into the cell. You're going to start seeing that rise in the bloodstream. And this block to insulin, it's sort of like the cell saying like, there's no room at the inn. And so like, we're going to help protect the cell from more coming in because we can't host it. So then you've got to think about, well, what are the things that are going to potentially make the mitochondria not able to process that glucose? And one of it's interesting, like one is just what we were talking about before, which is having just over being asked to process too much glucose. But there's other things, and really anything that creates oxidative stress. So too much free radical activity in the cell can also really hurt the mitochondria. So this is a way that insulin resistance and problems with glucose can arise actually separate from just too much glucose in the body, and that are really important to zero in on. And I think a framework to think about is like anything that's hurting my mitochondria is making me less metabolically healthy. Because then you open it up from it's just sugar that's causing diabetes and obesity to actually there's a whole world of things that can impact the mitochondria and lead to these problems. So for instance, like interestingly, fructose, which is not glucose, but it's, what's found in high fructose corn syrup and what's found in juice and in high levels in these foods that are refined fructose products. So interestingly, as fructose, even though it will not raise glucose in the bloodstream, it will be processed by the cell in such a way that it generates a metabolic byproduct called uric acid. And uric acid is a molecule that actually creates oxidative stress in the mitochondria. So even though this is glucose independent, it's creating a problem in the mitochondria, which is then telling the cell, we can't process all this glucose, become insulin resistant. So oxidative stress can happen. And uric acid is one example. Of course, other oxidized foods. So we hear a lot about oxidized seed oils. So these like vegetable oils and seed oils that are prone to oxidation, those can also hurt the mitochondria. And stress can do this as well. It can generate damage in the mitochondria. So that's just to say there's sort of a holistic world of things that can impact the mitochondria that can lead to problems with how the cell is processing glucose and cause glucose to rise in the body. And then you hear about all these, sort of things that people are doing now to kind of improve their health, the sort of biohackery type things like cold plunging and saunas and intermittent fasting. And I think it's interesting to just touch on this really quickly because in many ways, these are helping by impacting the mitochondria. When we're fasting, when we are putting the body into cold stress, when we do, high intensity interval training or zone 2 training, actually lower intensity, longer periods of training, what we are doing is we are stimulating the body to build more mitochondria.
So insulin produced in the pancreas picks up glucose and ushers it to cells for energy production. Muscle cells are actually an exception. They don't require insulin for glucose uptake. However, in general, the more glucose in the bloodstream, the more insulin is required. Now, eventually, excessive insulin will lead to cells becoming insulin resistant. The cells no longer accept glucose and it remains in the bloodstream. Now, some of the excess glucose, as I mentioned earlier, can get stockpiled as glycogen in the liver. However, much of it is stored as triglycerides in fat cells. Now, glucose can also bind with proteins like hemoglobin in the bloodstream to form inflammatory advanced glycation end products, also known as AGEs. And these molecules can damage the vascular system and set the stage for cardiovascular disease. Excessive glucose in the cells can lead to the overproduction of free radicals, these highly reactive molecules that can damage the mitochondria and cause oxidative stress. So the term oxidative stress is used to describe the condition of damage resulting when the critical balance between free radical generation and antioxidant defenses is unfavorable. Now, oxidative stress is involved with a whole wide host of physiological and neurological disorders, including cancer, heart disease, Parkinson's, autism, depression, and many others. In the case of cancer, for example, free radicals can induce DNA damage or mutation, which can lead to the production and proliferation of dysfunctional cells. So hopefully this provides you with enough reasons to avoid refined sugars and starches. So our next guest, Dr. Robert Lustig, is going to reveal some of the common foods that we eat that may be contributing to that oxidative stress and poisoning our mitochondria. So by the end of this episode, you'll have a solid list of foods to avoid the next time you're at the grocery store. Couple those with Dr. Means' suggestions on how to repair your mitochondria from the last segment, and you'll have a good running start. So Dr. Lustig is a pediatric endocrinologist and professor emeritus at the University of California, San Francisco. And he takes the information Dr. Means shared and broadens the scope while keeping it bite-sized in this next segment. And with that, I give you Dr. Robert Lustig.
Maybe you could begin by outlining the primary chronic or non-communicable diseases and give us just a sense of scale in terms of the health, economic, and planetary costs associated with these diseases.
Okay, if there's one word that your listeners need to walk away with and understand, it's mitochondria. Now, if you took 10th grade biology, you learned about the mitochondria. Okay, it is an essential component of high school biology education. Problem is, you haven't heard of it since, and you need to. It's the most important part of the cell. You hear about the nucleus all the time because that's where the DNA is, and everybody's into genetics. Well, this is actually a bigger problem than genetics. Mitochondria are the little energy burning factories inside each of our cells. Glucose is the primary energy source, but there are other energy sources as well, such as fat, ketones, amino acids, alcohol, and of course, fructose, which we will get to in a minute. All right. But glucose is the primary energy source. And there are two steps to turning glucose into energy to power the cell. The first step is called glycolysis. That's what yeasts do. Fermentation. That's the difference between wine and grape juice. And the second is what we call aerobic respiration, mitochondrial function. And that's where the majority of the ATPs, the adenosine triphosphates, the chemical energy that food gets turned into that powers the cell gets done. When your mitochondria work, you make lots of ATP, and that's what your cells want to do, especially brain cells, because they use a lot of ATP, because neurotransmission is ATP, energy intensive, ATP intensive. And there's no place to store energy in the brain because, I mean, you need your neurons for work, not for storage. Okay, so you need a steady supply of glucose, and you need a steady supply of energy, and you need a steady supply of mitochondrial function in order to make your brain work right. Well, anything that disrupts mitochondria is going to end up causing disease. And it turns out that there are chemicals in our environment that do that. Cyanide does that. But, cyanide's a poison. We know it. But there are a lot of things that do it that aren't considered poison, but they are because they disrupt mitochondrial function. Okay. Trans fats do that, and they are poison. We know that now, but we didn't know it for 100 years. The first trans fat was made in 1902. Crisco was patented in 1911, and by 1920, virtually every baked good in America was, made with trans fats because trans fats didn't go rancid vis-a-vis the 10-year-old Twinkie. All right, but it turns out the trans fats actually poisoned your mitochondria. Well, alcohol poisons your mitochondria, and branched-chain amino acids poison your mitochondria, and it turns out fructose, this sweet molecule in sugar, poisons your mitochondria too. And so if you can't get the ATP out of your cell, you're going to have cell dysfunction and ultimately cell death. And when you have cell death, guess what? You have human death too. So keeping your mitochondria on its tippy toes and working as efficiently to generate the most energy possible is a prime directive of health.
Hopefully, our experts in this episode inspired you to take care of those tiny organelles that have such a big hand in taking care of you. Here are some key takeaways from today's episode. Number one, the dysfunctional metabolism of glucose can produce an excessive amount of free radicals in the mitochondria, and this can degrade mitochondrial function and negatively impact energy production. Okay, number two, Nurture your mitochondria by consuming healthy fats, high quality protein, vegetables, and fiber, and limit your consumption of sugar and of starches. Number 3, implement lifestyle practices like intermittent fasting or cold hydrotherapy that stimulate the body to produce more mitochondria. This is called mitobiogenesis. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss another show. Leave a comment to let us know your thoughts, and don't forget to share our content with others who might benefit from this valuable information and the great experts that we assemble here on Commune. Okay, that's all from the Commune for today. My name is Jeff Krasno, and I am here for you.